Hello, and
Okay.
thank you for joining us for the Pharmacy Cannabis Lecture Series. Each session is designed to deliver a small and in-depth dose of cannabis education. I'm Candace Hawes, and I want to thank all of our viewers and all of our customers from the Pottery, from the Pharmacy Santa Ana, Santa Barbara, and Berkeley for joining us today. In this session, we're going to be discussing a debunking common cannabis myths and misconceptions. Myths and misconceptions about cannabis began spreading in the early 1900s and continue even today. The propaganda campaign against cannabis was led first and made most popular by Harry J. Anslinger, the former director of the now defunct Bureau of Bureau of Narcotics. The reason that he wanted to spread these misconceptions and propaganda campaigns is he wanted to demonize the users and public opinion. With public opinion in his favor, the government was able to criminalize and control minority populations and also benefit big industries competing with hemp. I can tell you from attending city council meetings across the state that even as a majority of adults nowadays support cannabis decriminalization, still some people hold on to the beliefs that cannabis is dangerous and it is the cause of many of our societal problems. But thankfully, with the advancements in legality, medical research, and the number of people who have been benefited by cannabis, many more people nowadays have a reasonable understanding of the plant. I'm really excited to welcome one of our favorite presenters, Dr. David Bearman, to dispel these common myths and misconceptions for us today. Dr. Bearman is an appropriate guest as he has written several books on the topic and has an article published in the Santa Barbara Independent titled "I Told You So, Setting the Record Straight." I first met Dr. Bearman in the early days of medical cannabis, where there are very few doctors who are taking the risk to risk their license to provide medical cannabis recommendations to patients in need. Dr. Bearman was one of the first in our state and is one of the last great doctors. Dr. Bearman is now retired, but had a long and successful career. In his 40 years practicing medicine, Dr. Bearman worked in public health, administrative medicine, primary care, pain management, and also cannabinology. Before working in the cannabis field, Dr. Bearman worked in the drug abuse treatment and prevention field, including served as the co-director of the Haight-Ashbury Drug Treatment Program, was a member of Governor Reagan's Interagency Task Force on Drug Abuse, a member of both the Santa Barbara and the San Diego County Drug Abuse Technical Advisory Committees, and a consultant to Hoffman LaRoche, Santa Barbara Schools, and the National PTA. Dr. Bearman currently serves as the Vice President at the American Academy of Cannabinoid Medicine. He's also been recognized by the Santa Barbara Medical Society with the Humanitarian Recognition Award. He is the author of several books on the history and medical use of cannabis. Cannabis Medicine, A Guide to Practical Cannabinoid Medicine, and Drugs Are Not the Devil's Tool. Dr. Bearman is also featured in the documentary Medical Cannabis and Its Impact on Human Health. For those reasons above, I'm a huge supporter of his work, and I'm really excited to have Dr. Bearman with us today as our guest speaker to dispel some common myths and misconceptions around cannabis. Thank you so much today for being with us, Doctor.
It's my pleasure to be here. You only forgot that I walk on the water. But I only go in up to my ankles. Okay. We're going to be talking about a lot of the myths that pertain to cannabis, and there's been this concerted effort over the last 100 years to somehow marginalize cannabis. And one has to ask the question as to why, because cannabis has been around as a medicine for over 4,000 years. So let's take a look here. We want to go through some of the major fictional allegations surrounding medicinal cannabis. You can't go after cannabis with the truth, so its opponents try to go after cannabis with the lies. One of the original proponents of the lies was the petrochemical industry. The William Randolph Hearst, who owned a string of newspapers, really popularized the term marijuana. The reason that he did that was that people were very familiar with cannabis, as we'll see. Okay, so there are a lot of myths out there that I hope to touch on in this discussion. Some people say cannabis is not a medicine. And why did they say that? Well, it's a plant. Well, where did we get our medicines from for thousands and thousands of years? Plants. Plants are medicine. Cannabis is medicine. You all know that. And fortunately, more and more people in the medical profession are knowing that. In the case of cannabis medicinal value, lay people often know more about that than physicians. Some people say, well, medical cannabis is a modern concept. You just made that up. They say that, it's an excuse for people to get high. Now, getting high or feeling good or euphoria, generally not considered to be a bad thing. Euphoria is a sense of well-being. What I think some of the concerns are is that these, like other medications, there's a dose-related phenomenon, and if you take too much, if you make a pig of yourself, you're likely to have dysphoria. That is to feel uncomfortably out of touch with reality. But if you use cannabis in appropriate dosage form, it's going to have the therapeutic effect that you are looking for. So organized medicine does not oppose medical cannabis. Organized medicine, as you will see, has been a big supporter of medicinal cannabis, and we'll go into the facts on that on the slide on that one. The idea that government organizations don't approve of cannabis is not true. Every major commission that's been done around the world has recommended the legalization of cannabis, even for recreational use, let alone medical use. Cannabis is not harmful to your health. Cannabis is a nutrient. It can be beneficial in terms of dealing with sleep, in terms of dealing with relaxation. There is no harm to your health from the use of cannabis. As a matter of fact, cannabis is quite safe, as we will see later on in this discussion. There's a real stinker in terms of the idea that cannabis can be harmful to the fetus. There were some great studies that was done that reviewed the studies that purported to show that, and they showed nothing of the sort. They showed that it did not cause damage to fetus. The idea that cannabis causes brain damage is related to a crazy piece of research that was done in the 1970s. In fact, cannabis is neuroprotective. In the 1930s, the AMA, which opposed the Marijuana Tax Act, did say that they were concerned that cannabis was not standardized. After all, it's a plant. Well, we've legalized cannabis. There are all kinds of studies and tests that the material that you buy at the dispensary must pass. And so cannabis is standardized, and it's becoming more standardized. So if your package of cannabis says it contains 0.5 of a milligram of THC, chances are pretty good it contains around 5 milligrams of THC, and so on and so forth. Also, as we're getting more sophisticated, the packaging includes some of the terpenes. And as you know, for some of the previous webinars, cannabis has a couple of hundred terpenes, and terpenes are the most common molecule appearing in nature. There are more than 20,000 terpenes, and it occurs in spices, pine trees. It includes in fruit, and many of these terpenes are good for you. And you should check with your nutritionist to find out what suggestions they have in terms of what you might eat that could be beneficial to you. This thing about cannabis being harmful to the fetus, we'll see that there were numerous studies that were done that show that it has little or no effect. And in many cases, the effect that it has is positive, not negative. Then there's this crazy one that cannabis causes brain damage. Well, it does cause brain damage if you're doing research on monkeys and you put a gas mask on them and you pump in all kinds of cannabis smoke. You're now depriving the monkey of oxygen. And as we've known for thousands of years, a deprivation of oxygen can cause brain damage. So this fellow did not discover that cannabis caused brain damage. He just reiterated that lack of oxygen can cause brain damage. This thing about cannabis is a tool of the devil. You hear that sometimes from outrageous opponents. And this has to do with a comment that was made by Pope Innocent VI in the 15th century. And we'll talk about that in a little minute. Cannabis can cause psychosis or schizophrenia. This is based on one poorly done study that's never been repeated. And in fact, cannabis is helpful in treating bipolar disorder. And this is according to Dr. Daniel Pielli, a PhD in pharmacology at the University of California at, where the heck is he at? He's at the University of California.
Irvine.
Okay, and the idea that cannabis is a gateway drug is really absurd because cannabis is an exit drug. At least 4 states have approved cannabis for the treatment of opiate use disorder. That's an exit drug. Okay, let's move on to the next slide here. So what do I got here? Cannabis is not medicine, is what some people say. It's appeared in every major materia medica since it appeared in what is believed to be the first one, the Ping Tao Ching in China in 2637 BC. That's according to Chinese oral tradition. That was in Ayurvedic medicine, which is used in India in hard copy, stone tablets, dated to be somewhere between 1100 and 1700 BC. It's found in the Ebers Papyrus, which was in Egypt, and around 1500 BCE. Discordus, who was Nero's physician, had it in his Materia Medica starting in 70 AD. And his Materia Medica was popularly used in Europe, at least until the Pope stuck his oar in the water. It was in the United States Pharmacopoeia, which is a semi-official compendium of products and therapeutic agents that are commonly used in the United States. And it was in there from the 1850s until 1942. Okay, and cannabis was used as medicine in various forms. This was a asthma cigarette, Grimaldi, which was made in India, and there are a number of other cigarettes, Caradonna, which is made in Australia, and they were advertised for the treatment of asthma and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. So let's see what else we got here. Some people say, well, cannabis is a modern concept. You made it up to excuse the hippies. In fact, cannabis was well known for use amongst jazz musicians in the 1920s, but it goes back to at least 4,000 years ago when it was in the Ping Chao Ching. So cannabis has been around for a long time. It was in the United States Pharmacopoeia from the 1850s to 1942. Now, cannabis was reintroduced into the medical armamentarium in Europe in 1839 by W.B. O'Shaughnessy, who learned of the therapeutic benefits when he was working in India, helping to put the telegraph across India, which he was later knighted for. At the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, cannabis was the third most common ingredient in prescriptions and in patent medicines after opium and alcohol. So it was available a lot. It was available at your corner drugstore. and it was often available without a prescription. You could just buy patent medicines off the shelf. But look, American doctors did write millions of cannabis prescriptions, cannabis-containing prescriptions. As many as 3 million a year were written in the 1920s by American physicians. In addition, there were 25 cannabis-containing over-the-counter medications that you could buy without a prescription. And a biggie in 1937, the AMA testified against the Marijuana Tax Act. The man testifying had been the Commissioner of Health of Washington, D.C., the medical conditioner for the city of Boston, and was past president of the American Public Health Association. So I think we can assume that he knew what he was talking about. And he said that cannabis, that the AMA knew of no dangers from the medical use of cannabis. Okay, what else we got here? All right. So cannabis has been around for thousands of years. It's not something that was just made up by a bunch of long-haired hippies and the fuzzy freak brothers. The AMA has not consistently opposed the medical use of cannabis. In fact, has been a consistent supporter. In 1892, Sir William Osler, considered not only one of the founders of modern medicine, was also one of the founders of Johns Hopkins School of Medicine in Baltimore. He was the author of one of the first books on medicine, on medicine for just general use. And he, in all three editions of his textbook, he wrote that cannabis is the best treatment for treating migraines. In 1894, Queen Victoria was treated by the royal physician, Sir Joshua Reynolds, with a tincture of cannabis for PMS, and it's still used for that today. Sir Joshua Reynolds also wrote an article in The Lancet, certainly considered by the British to be the preeminent medical journal, peer-reviewed medical journal in the world. And in 1894, he wrote an article on the benefits of cannabis. I think that was the first edition of The Lancet.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool.
In the 1920s, as I said there earlier, American physicians wrote 3 million cannabis-containing prescriptions a year. In addition, of course, there were over 25 patent medicines on the market that contained cannabis. In 1927, Remington's Textbook of Pharmacy, which was the standard textbook used in pharmacy school, on page 999 and 1000 tells you how to make tincture of cannabis. In fact, this was an assignment at the University of Minnesota School of Pharmacy, where my father, who was a pharmacist, went to pharmacy school. And in the article, it includes that cannabis is useful in treating pain and anxiety. And those are the two most common reasons for doctors recommending cannabis today. In 1937, the AMA testified vigorously against the Marijuana Tax Act, and they said that the AMA knew of no dangers from the medical use of cannabis. In 1942, the longtime editor of the Journal of the American Medical Association, Dr. Morris Fishbein, I'm sorry, I've got some misspelling here, said cannabis was the best treatment for migraine. A pretty good idea to agree with Sir William Osler. In 1943, Colonel James Phelan, who was the editor of the Military Surgeon at the time, the semi-official medical journal of the military, wrote an editorial entitled The Marijuana Bugaboo, which was highly critical of the Marijuana Tax Act. In 1944, the New York Academy of Medicine, as part of the LaGuardia Crime Commission report, recommended legalization of cannabis for recreational use. And for that, Harry Anslinger, who is considered to be responsible, wrongly so, for the Marijuana Tax Act, went after the New York Academy of Medicine. The Marijuana Tax Act was in all probability promoted by the petrochemical industry, particularly by Lamont DuPont, who recognized hemp, not marijuana. And of course, hemp and marijuana and cannabis are all the same plant, as competition to the petrochemical industry, to such products as nylon and rayon, which were made by DuPont. DuPont also made tetraethyl lead, an additive to gasoline, and you can make diesel gasoline out of hemp. In fact, Henry Ford always thought that cars should run on diesel, particularly hemp diesel. In 1947, Ramsey and Davis did one of the first modern studies on THC, and they showed that it successfully treated intractable epilepsy in a group of 7 children who were institutionalized for having cerebral palsy. And of the 7, 5 had no or almost no seizures. This demonstrates that THC is more effective than CBD in helping to control intractable seizure. Now, it does have a beneficial effect. It decreases the frequency of intractable seizures by about 30%. THC, on the other hand, in the Ramsey and Davis study, decreased the frequency of intractable seizures in 5 of the 7 study subjects by over 90%.
Wow.
In 1953, Colonel Phelan was still in charge of military medicine. It had changed its name from military surgeon, but it was the same journal, and entitled The Marijuana Bugaboo Revisited. He hadn't changed his mind that there was nothing wrong with cannabis. Okay, so there have been a lot of studies that have been done on cannabis by governments, and one would think from some of the public publications that all of these studies showed that there was a problem. Fact of the matter is the opposite. None of these studies show that there was a problem. They all recommended legalization of cannabis for recreational use, or at least not making it illegal. And these were done by the United States Army, the New York Academy of Medicine, the Wooten Commission in England, the Nixon Marijuana Commission in the US, and the Ledane Commission in Canada. And you may want to get the book put out by the Nixon Marijuana Commission. It's a 2-volume report, and it has a great deal of research that I think that you would find interesting, particularly since it's put out by the United States government.
Yeah.
Okay, so then there are some people who got it completely backwards and say cannabis is harmful to your health. So we know that it's got 4,000 years of human use, and one would think that if there were a problem, it would have turned up in the last 4,000 years. And what has turned up is cannabis safety and utility. In 1937, for instance, Dr. William C. Woodward, past president of the American Public Health Association, in his testimony, which was excoriating, opposing the Marijuana Tax Act, and he said that the AMA knows of no harms from the medical use of cannabis. And this was at a time when 3 million prescriptions a year had been written in the 1920s and a couple of 100,000 a year in the 1930s. In 1988, the DEA's chief administrative law judge, one Francis Young, in his finding of fact, found that marijuana was one of the safest therapeutic agents known to man. Pretty good, huh?
Yeah.
And he recommended rescheduling cannabis to Schedule 2. Of course, the government, in its wisdom, ignored his recommendation. In 1999, the Institute of Medicine report on cannabis reported that, number one, it had medical value. Well, we all know that. We've known it for 4,000 years. And that the side effects of cannabis are in the same range of prescription drugs that were then on the market. I'm going to get up for a second and release the beast here. The animal wants to get outside. Hang on one second.
No problem.
Okay.
Yeah, as we can see from what Dr. Bearman's already shared with us, I hear a lot of these same myths and misconceptions by city council members, and you can see here just dozens and dozens of medical organizations and then state organizations, government organizations that have, done their own research.
Indeed, and the reason that the states get away with that is that we have a constitution. Now, not everybody who is in politics recognizes the Constitution. I have in mind the former president of the United States. I believe his name was Donald Trump. And the Constitution calls for something called states' rights. As a matter of fact, about 15 or 20 years ago, the comedic wag started saying that states' rights isn't just for racists anymore. So the federal government does not have the authority to regulate the practice of medicine. They do have the authority to regulate interstate commerce. Mm-hmm. So this is why a lot of states have said, if you're going to sell cannabis legally in our state, you need to grow the cannabis in our state, because then it doesn't go across state lines, and it cuts out the authority of the federal government. So I think that is pretty important, to understand states' rights. And that is why the laws vary from state to state, because it is the state governments that are making the rules, not the federal government. Okay, so we have continued to have research. This is just a partial list. In 1999, THC, which of course is legal, and THC is the thing that the opponents of cannabis get all excited about. It has only been legal for 30 years. And it was down-regulated from Schedule 2, which is the more restrictive category, to Schedule 3, which is less restrictive.
Is this just for medical applications of THC, like for pharmaceutical companies? Like
yes.
Marinol and stuff?
Yes, exactly. Good question. And I want to talk about Marinol. I didn't mention that earlier. Marinol was invented in 1980s, and it was made Schedule 3 or Schedule 2, which means that it needed to have a duplicate prescription written so that it was easier for the federal government to track. Marinol originally was approved for treatment of appetite stimulation in people who had HIV/AIDS, and for treatment of some of the pain that could be associated with HIV/AIDS. In 2004, the Department of Health and Human Services patented CBD. I'm not sure how you patent a plant, but they patented this. They patented this constituent of the plant. In 2005, finally, we got back to cannabis as medicine in Canada. Tincture of cannabis, Sativex, which is equal parts CBD and THC, whole plant alcohol extract of cannabis, and it has been available for prescription use in Canada since 2005. In 2009, the American Medical Association House of Delegates requested that cannabis be rescheduled to Schedule 2. And there were a number of experts who testified in favor of this. I was one of them. And their recommendation was ignored by the federal government. What else was new? In 2010, there was a successful clinical trial in upstate New York on the use of cannabis for intractable pain, such as pain for cancer. I heard a short presentation by one of the physicians that had been involved in that and later had moved to Israel to do additional work. But there's no question that cannabis is useful in the treatment of pain. In fact, the Institute Medicine name that as one of the therapeutic applications. Okay, so in 2018, Epidiolex, which is only CBD, and people say, well, CBD is not psychoactive. That's wrong. CBD is psychoactive because it is a tranquilizer. It's a relaxant. It's not euphorogenic, which THC is euphorogenic. But a lot of the terminology that is used in identifying cannabis and its properties is used incorrectly and improperly. And that, of course, contributes to the misunderstanding. And the misunderstanding is, of course, important. I think we can take a look at opponents of science with the recent attacks on the recommendations made regarding the vaccine for COVID. I think Dr. Fauci, who's about 80 years old and had been involved in the field of immunization for somewhere around 60 years, has a pretty good inkling as to what the true scientific facts really are. And I think that the same thing is true of cannabis when we take a look at its relationship to the endocannabinoid system, which is the largest neurotransmitter system in the human body. So there's this scare tactic that if you smoke cannabis when you are pregnant, it's going to damage the fetus. Melanie Dreyer, who is the past dean of the School of Nursing, both at the University of Iowa and the University of Chicago, did a study in Jamaica in 1968, and then a follow-up study in 1972. These studies were all funded by the National Institute of Medicine, and they were eager to find out that these studies would prove that there were a great harm that came to these fetuses. In fact, there were great benefit that came to the fetuses. They did better in school than the women who did not use cannabis during pregnancy, and they reached their developmental landmarks sooner than the children of women who did not use cannabis during pregnancy. So the upshot of this is that NIDA had intended to do future follow-up studies, and they defunded the study because they didn't get the result that they assumed that they were getting. In 2014, there was a report on over 30 studies by Dr. Torres Vargas, who has a PhD from Columbia, and she worked with Carl Hart, who's well known in the field. And she looked at 30 different studies done on women who had used cannabis during pregnancy, and there were 360 possible different variables, and almost all of them were negative. There were 8 variables that were positive once in one of the studies. So you got to repeat your results in order for it to be meaningful. And there also were a number of positive findings about the use of cannabis during pregnancy. The other thing that we find is that it interferes with the nausea and vomiting that can be associated with the pregnancy. Mm-hmm. And in fact, one of the treatments for that, one of the prescription treatments actually has adverse side effects, which cannabis does not. The main side effects of using cannabis to deal with nausea and vomiting is if you take too much, it may cause dysphoria. So, as I think I said earlier, Dr. Dreyer's study of children and women who use cannabis in pregnancy in Jamaica did better in school and reached their developmental landmark sooner than the children who did not. And Dr. Torres Vargas was really a seminal study that demonstrated that in all of these 30 studies, all of which were paid for by the National Institute of Drug Abuse, and if you read the abstract, you won't find out that they said we didn't find anything wrong. You have to read the whole study as Dr. Torres Vargas did, and you find out there were no problems or no significant problems or no repeat significant problems. So then there's this crazy one that cannabis can cause brain damage. Where the heck did this come from? Now, if I'd have had a little more time, I'd have put a wonderful illustration in here, which shows a monkey with a gas mask over its mouth. And what's going into the gas mask is not our oxygen, it's cannabis. And what this scientist, who was kind of a anti-cannabis zealot, proved is if you decrease the oxygen input into a mammal, you can cause brain damage. So he proved something that had been proved for hundreds, if not thousands of years regarding oxygen, and proved Zippo regarding cannabis. Now, one would think that if cannabis caused brain damage, there would be some evidence of it other than a monkey with a gas mask. And there has been no such evidence of that. And we find that what is important in terms of the way the brain functions is a multitude of problems that may affect brain damage, the home environment, post-traumatic stress disorder, attention deficit disorder, traumatic brain disorder, use of alcohol, tobacco, and other dangerous drugs. The study I referred to by Dr. Chesnoff was a multi-modality program for children of women who use cocaine. I realize cocaine and cannabis are two different things, but what he found is that providing these multiple interventions to this cohort of children and their families, their mother, that these children did better in school than children of women who did not use cocaine. In addition, what he found is that the longer the child was in the school system in Chicago, Illinois, the lower their IQ got. So there are a lot of things that affect IQ, including the quality of education that you receive in school, as well as the amount of intellectual stimulation that you receive at home. Now, there was an excellent study done by a combination of UCLA and the University of Minnesota. Since my father went to pharmacy school at the University of Minnesota, I have a soft spot in my heart for them. It was a twin study that showed an IQ drop of 4 points. In both the users and non-users of cannabis, demonstrated, at least to my satisfaction, that the cannabis had no effect on this. It was just a natural thing that happened due to the test that they took. The IQ test may have been different, or due to the things that they're studying. IQ tests are developed for Anglo-Saxons, for Caucasian Americans, and Time magazine several years ago had an IQ test that was developed for African Americans. If I'm not mistaken, I failed that IQ test. I mean, it depends on what questions that you ask. So in my 1937 University of Washington Medical School class, several AOA, that is the American Honor Society of Medical Students, had used cannabis. Matter of fact, I think the number one graduate in the class did. He was originally from Los Angeles, so you know how crazy those people from Los Angeles can be. All right, so the this brain damage business is, I think, poppycock is probably the best way of putting it. Now, one of the things that the AMA testified about in the Marijuana Tax Act was that cannabis wasn't standardized. So you weren't exactly sure what dose you were getting, and doctors are kind of persnickety about wanting to know what dose they're giving the person. And in fact, you use different doses for different therapeutic actions that you're trying to get. You can use a dose as low as 2.5 milligrams of THC to treat um, autism and to treat attention deficit disorder. You may need levels of 15 milligrams of THC to treat pain, and between 300 and 800 milligrams of cannabinoids, and all cannabinoids, to begin to have an effect on sending some forms of cancer into remission. Um, so there are currently standardized products on the market. Sativex, which is manufactured by by GW Pharmaceuticals, is equal constituents of THC and CBD. It's legalized in 24 countries, and it is standardized. Epidiolex is 100% CBD. It was approved by by the FDA as a Schedule 5 drug in 2018. I can't even remember if Schedule 5 drugs require a prescription, but it's the lowest level and the least damaging. Marinol, dronabinol, and Syndros are all made by, let's see, the company in Arizona in Glendale, which skips my memory right now. But they're all synthetic THC. They're all on the market. They all can be gotten with a prescription medication. And if you do have a prescription for one of those and you get tested for the presence of THC, that study is reported as negative because what they're looking for is illicit drugs. Yep. And if you have a prescription, that's not an illicit drug. And this has been helpful to a number of patients who either stopped using THC entirely or use Marinol and THC. And in order to find out if there's THC, it costs another $300 or $400 to do the test. And most medical review officers don't order that, and if they do, it usually doesn't get approved. Let's see what else we got here. So sometimes you hear real opponents say that cannabis is a tool of the devil. Well, that does have a historical basis for that. Pope Innocent VI in the 15th century said that cannabis was a tool of the devil. Why? Because it relieved the pain of childbirth. Well, why is that the devil's work? Because we know that he was punished for eating from the tree of knowledge. So the Pope referred to the midwives as witches, and this led to the witch hunts of the Dark Ages, and it stopped the use of cannabis as a medicine in Europe for most of Europe. It continued to be used to make beer. After all, cannabis is a cousin to hops, and to be used in breakfast cereal. It was used in gruel, and Dickens gave gruel a bad name because he was talking about gruel in orphanages where they watered down the gruel. Don't eat watered down gruel. And so cannabis continued to be used as medicine in China, India, Southeast Asia, a number of places. Egypt, it didn't stop being used. It just stopped being used in Europe because the Pope had said it was a tool of the devil. And also the chances were, if you were a midwife, you would be charged with being a witch. And the way you tested on if somebody was a witch or not is you sewed them in a leather bag and threw them in the lake or the river. If they sank, uh, they were a witch. If they floated, they were a witch. Not a good idea to be charged with being a witch in the Dark Ages. So then we got this crazy one that cannabis causes mental health injuries or conditions. And there was one study that showed that there was a 4%, a 0.4%, not 4%, a 0.4% increase in the incidence of schizophrenia in people who used cannabis than those who didn't. There was another study, these were done in England, of 600,000 patients that showed that didn't happen. So, in order for a study to be relevant, it needs to be repeatable. Furthermore, one would think that if cannabis affected the incidence of schizophrenia, you would have seen an increase in the amount of schizophrenia during the 60s and the 70s when large percentages of people used cannabis. There was no such spike. In fact, Daniel Piamelli, who was in charge of research on cannabis at UC Irvine, that's what I forgot before when I was talking about this, found that cannabis was useful in treating bipolar disorder. One of the things that we see is a consistent systematic finding is that the charges of the problems with cannabis, the truth is almost exactly the opposite. So here we have it charged with causing schizophrenia, and a respected researcher who's in charge of research at UC Irvine found exactly the opposite. Now, then another point that's sometimes made is that cannabis is a gateway drug. Now, one of the problems I think with people who come up with these allegations is they read the headline in the newspaper, maybe they read the abstract of the study, they don't read the study like Dr. Torres Vargas read the study. When you read the study, you're likely to find out what they actually did and what they actually found. The headlines are to sell newspapers, not to tell people about the results of the study. Now, cannabis can be an exit drug. It's not a gateway drug. One of the interesting factoids in terms of statistics is everybody, almost everybody that has used cannabis has used cocaine. 1% of people who have used cocaine have used cannabis. So, I mean, the statistics, when you look at them, tell us just the opposite. And furthermore, at least 4 states have approved the use of cannabis for the treatment of opiate use disorder. And that's in part because cannabis is a very effective painkiller. And many people who had been using opiates to treat pain used cannabis. All right. So, cannabis is not a gateway drug. And I had several patients who used cannabis to treat their alcoholism and remain sober. One of them was an assistant district attorney in a jurisdiction somewhere south of San Francisco. We won't say where. and he remained alcohol free for the 30 years that I saw him.
Oh, wow.
And he attributed it solely to his use of cannabis. And of course, he wasn't the only one, but he was one probably worth mentioning at the top of the list. Also, when treating substance abuse, I had a number of patients who used cannabis to treat their alcoholism and remain sober, such as this gentleman that I mentioned. When treating substance abuse, it is not very helpful to focus on the drug that the patient is using. We need to focus on the motivation. Why
Yeah.
do we have so much use of opiates inappropriately on the East Coast, particularly in the South? Well, one is that in Florida physicians write 40 prescriptions of all the opiate prescriptions in the United States.
Wow.
This is according to a presentation made by a faculty member at Cedars-Sinai. I think Cedars-Sinai has some pretty good faculty members, so I think she may have known what she was talking about. And a lot of this stuff that was prescribed in Florida runs up the coast to Canada, to Kentucky or Tennessee, other places in the South. And you also have a large opiate abuse in places like Vermont and Maine and New Hampshire. What's the reason for this? The reason for this is that life is miserable for these people because many of the occupations that they were employed in, like lumbering, possibly fishing, tobacco growing, have decreased the amount of help that they need in order to make a living, because the demand for some of these things is less, and therefore a number of these hard workers have lost their job, and they're very frustrated and depressed. And also the availability of the cannabinoids, particularly from the doctors in Kentucky, is something that contributes to this. The thing that we could do in terms of decreasing the opiate medication is to use alternatives such as cannabis. We also can use maybe turmeric and other things. And of course, to get a job, and there are many jobs available in the cannabis industry. So the cannabis industry there again can be helpful in terms of dealing with abuse of opiates. And as I said, the governments of at least 4 states have approved cannabis for the treatment of opiate use disorder. I want to thank you very much for listening to this presentation. You may want to try David Bearman at cox.net, because sometimes my other one has been hacked. So David Bearman at cox.net. You can order my book, Cannabis Medicine, A Guide to the Practice of Cannabinoid Medicine, or Drugs Are Not the Devil's Tools, from me personally. You can send a letter to my old office number, and it will be forwarded to the post office. I really appreciated the opportunity to speak with you. You found a medicine that has few side effects. I can't remember. I think I may have skipped one of the slides that the DEA's chief administrative law judge said that cannabis was one of the safest therapeutic agents known to man. And that's a pretty strong statement. There are few side effects to cannabis. Most of the side effects are related to taking an inappropriate dose or an excessive dose. Relatively small doses of cannabis uh, can be useful in treating most conditions, and there are also a number of things that you can use that can decrease the uncomfortable high.
Yeah.
Biting down on a peppercorn, the caryophyllene is useful in blocking some of the euphoria of THC. Also, CBD, of course, is useful in doing that. Some people find that taking a hot shower can be useful. There are a number of useful books that are out there. Julie Holland's book, I think it's called the Cannabis book, uh, is very good. Uh, and Deborah Malka just came out with a book that would be pretty good for practitioners. Uh, there's lots of information that's out there. I've got a number of other uh, videos that you can access that discuss cannabis for treatment of attention deficit disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and we've talked about pain. And I'm going to go back to Candace, who does such an excellent job of moderating these, and have her throw in the questions that you are hopefully going to get some good answers to.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Doctor. I always love hearing you talk, and you really presented a lot of good evidence to, like, if we have people tell us these kind of myths in the future, we can, tell them some of the evidence that you provided us today. So that's so helpful. One question, I'm just going to pick one question out of the questions. I hear a lot that cannabis causes cancer and that cannabis smoking causes cancer. So can you address that too?
Yeah, somehow I skipped some of the ones here, and I'm sorry for that.
No worries.
Uh,
Yeah, there's a lot.
I'm not sure what happened. I mean, let's talk about cancer, cannabis not causing cancer, and let's talk about cannabis causing brain damage, and let's talk about cannabis being a an entry drug. Again, I don't know what happened to the slides, but I do remember what was in them. So cannabis has been shown to be an anti-cancer drug. There are some studies that have been done, as well as numerous anecdotal reports. There was a study done by GW Pharmaceuticals in England, and they treated the people with glioblastoma, which is a very aggressive cancer, with 150 milligrams of cannabinoids a day for 3 months, and they lived 40% longer, 550 days to 320 days. They did this by the endocannabinoid system interfering with the metastasis of the cancer. It boy, what am I'm missing here? It stops
Like generating new cancer cells, and it helps with like apoptosis, right?
right. Apoptosis is the death of cannabis cells, and it probably does this by increasing the amount of uh, boy, the stuff that's in mangoes.
Nursing?
Myrcene. Myrcene is anti. Tends to it increases the amount of myrcene in abnormal cells, and it kills the cells.
That's great. And you talked about too, there was a UCLA study where they found that people that smoke cannabis and cigarettes they had less likelihood of getting cancer than people that just smoke cigarettes alone, right?
Well, the real group that decreased were the people that smoke cannabis alone. The cannabis kills cancer cells and prevents the replication of the cannabis cells. I have a friend of mine who is a lay healer. She has kept several pancreatic cancer patients alive for 10 or 12 years. And pancreatic cancer is generally its life expectancy is less than a year. So this was pretty amazing. As a matter of fact, one of her patients was friends of Deepak Chopra and what's his name, Tutu, who just passed away. And she got to meet with them about 2 or 3 months ago because of her success in treating this woman's pancreatic cancer. And I don't know what happened to the, the other thing I wanted to mention is, I think we talked about cancer being a exit drug, not an entry drug.
So one more question. This is the last question. This is a good question one of the viewers just submitted. So they said, do you feel that the industry perpetuates some of these myths because their primary focus on providing materials, but not so much the tools to use it properly, like in regards to encouraging people to use cannabis a lot, use it recreationally? Do you think that sometimes the industry makes these, reinforces these stereotypes because we're trying to, in some ways encourage people to use a lot of cannabis?
I'm discouraged by the fact that so much emphasis has been placed on the recreational use rather than medical use.
Yeah.
This is truly a miracle drug that has been around for over 4,000 years. And we know the mechanism of action. We know that it prevents metastasis. We know that it promotes apoptosis. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of anecdotal reports. And of course, we have the study that was done in England. Studies aren't done in the United States because cannabis is a Schedule I drug, which means in the United States, cannabis has no known medical use. Apparently, the 34 states that legalized that didn't get the memo. It should be rescheduled to Schedule I so that we can use THC, because THC is critical to the effective use of cannabis as medicine. I think I've covered everything, although I may have skipped a slide, and if I did, I apologize for that.
Yeah, no, you've done a wonderful job. We addressed 11 of the biggest common myths, and then we also just covered the cancer one. These are a lot of the things that we hear all the time. Like I said, I'm still going to city council meetings and hearing people repeat these kinds of things. And so it's so important that even though a lot of people think this is common knowledge, people now, since we have so many people using cannabis and benefiting from it, people don't think these things, but they still do. So thank you so much for coming on today and sharing your information, helping to dispel these myths. Hopefully everybody that's watching can, when they hear these things in the future, can now address them with factual evidence and point people in the right way to do their own research. So this has been very, very, very helpful. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Candace. It's a pleasure to be here. I hope I hit all the high points and gave you what you were looking for.
Oh yeah, definitely. No, so thank you again for being with us. Thank you to Amy for helping to make this webinar possible as well. I love working with you guys. And I hope that all of our audience members that are watching today, I hope that we were able to share some information with you that will help you become better informed cannabis consumers, and that the information that we shared will help you find some relief. Thank you very much and have a great day. Everybody stay safe and stay well, and we'll see you next time for the next episode of the Pharmacy Cannabis Lecture Series.
Thank you. Oh, don't forget to go out and buy the book.
Yes.
Cannabis Medicine, A Guide to the Practice of Cannabinoid Medicine, and Drugs Are Not the Devil's Tools, which is a wonderful, interesting history book that I think that your audience would enjoy.
I do. Yeah, I would definitely second that. I definitely recommend getting those books. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.